Okay, hi biology. It's Mr. Strong here. I thought that I would try recording some of these lectures in case some of you guys wanted to take a look at them kind of more on your own time for review purposes. This is a lot of the same stuff we're going to cover in class, but if you have any questions that don't get answered just due to time constraints, then you can take a look back at this and kind of see what we talked about, and I might be able to touch on a few other topics. So I'm going to give this a try and see if it works. So let's shift over to this right here. And this week in class, we were talking about organism and population ecology. I combined these two just because they were both kind of short, and I thought it might be a little bit easier to just put them all together. But we could have certainly done one on organism ecology and one on population ecology. So let's go ahead and get started with organism ecology. The first thing we talked about, well, we wanted to define it. We said it's the branch of ecology that deals with an organism's adaptations and how they are able to survive in their environment. We needed an organism to use for this. And the organism that we talked about and we'll talk about today is the yellow jacket. And anytime you're talking about organism ecology, you are trying to come up with ways to connect the, the abiotic conditions of the environment with the adaptations of that organism that allow them to live in those abiotic conditions. So we talked about how the temperature range here in North Texas, because these guys do live here in North Texas, it ranges on like an average year from about 20 degrees Fahrenheit to maybe about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It can certainly get a little bit colder and a little bit hotter than that, but that's kind of like what we would see on a regular year. We do have fresh water here, no salt water. That water is in the form of rivers, lakes, and we also get rainfall. But that rainfall is definitely going to be seasonal. Not nearly as much in the late summer as we do in the spring, and so we call that seasonal rainfall. It varies from month to month. We also, just to have a few other of these, our elevation here is around 700 feet above sea level. The reason that matters is because that's going to affect the O2 concentration, or the thin air, basically. If you've ever been up on top of a mountain and try to do anything like physical, you would notice that it's kind of hard to breathe and hard to do things like run or anything like that. And that has to do with the amount of oxygen that's there. So the question we ask is, all right, so these guys, these yellow jackets, they live here in North Texas, and they live in all of these conditions. So we would never expect to find yellow jackets that live here in North Texas that could only survive from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, because then they wouldn't live here. So the adaptations that they have, at least partly, allow them to survive in these conditions right here. We could go into all those adaptations and how they can maybe go dormant for certain parts of the winter. Maybe they leave eggs underground, things like that. But whatever those adaptations are, they allow them to live there. The other thing that I like to kind of bring up right here as we talk about what an organism does in its environment is the term niche. Right. And that's not really connected directly to this, but it's an important term to use because this is the organism's role in the environment. Okay, that's the job that it plays. It's in the case of a yellow jacket, its niche would be a colony insect that is a herbivore that feeds on flower pollen and flower nectar, and is a competitor with bees, and is preyed upon by birds and nests in trees. And so if we describe its entire role in the environment, we would be talking about its niche. But I also tend to think of that niche as fitting into this environment with these conditions and all the other biotic things that would be in there as well. So since we're talking about niche, the organism's niche right now, it's probably a good time to that's right. We talked about a couple of different adaptations right here, just to give you some other examples. And one of the ones we talked about was polar bears, and how clearly they have lots of adaptations for their highly kind of specialized environment. But the one that I wanted to point out was their feet, because as marine mammals, they spend a lot of time in the water. And so if you were to compare the average size of a polar bear's feet with the average size of, say, like a brown bear's foot, yes, polar bears are overall bigger, but their feet are much, much bigger than a brown bear's. And in class, you guys came up with excellent reasons why. So as to not fall in the snow, it's kind of like built-in snowshoes. But the biggest reason is probably because they are swimmers. They spend a huge amount of their time in the water, swimming. Sometimes found, so far away from land that you cannot even see land. So miles and miles and miles away from land, as they move from area to area. And so those large feet will definitely help them. Thorns on a cactus is an adaptation that allows it to live in an area where animals might want to eat it because they have to store the cactus has to store water, and so they had to evolve that adaptation to protect themselves. And the dark color in whale meat right here allows them to store oxygen for staying underwater much longer. They have lots of specialized adaptations for that, but that's just one of them. So all right, if we move forward to, remember we were talking about the niche, then we could describe this term called biodiversity as the number of niches filled in an environment by separate species. And so if we put just two, I drew these a long time ago and I just kept them, I tried to make them very, very simple. But if we just drew two environments, then we would say that this one is not diverse and this one is diverse. And so right away we can look at this and think, okay, well, we have just like one species right here, and this one we have like taller trees and even or tall trees and even taller trees and birds and small bushes and small animals and climbing animals and just everything. So it doesn't matter. I just tried to make it simple. The reason why that matters is when you have lots of niches filled, then this environment is using most of the available energy. Because we would also say that all of the niches are filled. And we could say that there is no excess energy. Any light that maybe happens to fall in between these trees is going to be absorbed by those plants, and those plants can be eaten by the herbivores, and they can be eaten by carnivores, and so there's no available energy. But over here, we have empty, or what we'd say unfilled or unfulfilled, I think, niches. And that means we have an excess of energy. There is energy that maybe falls in between these two trees from sunlight and it hits the ground and it is not absorbed by anything. And so it's a waste of energy. And the reason why that matters is if we move on to the next one, which is a really similar slide to this one, invasive species. Okay, so I use the exact same pictures right here, and we have the exact same idea. We have a not biodiverse environment, and we have a biodiverse environment. We have wasted energy on the right-hand side, and we have all of the energy is being utilized here. And in both cases, let's imagine that a seed of this plant called kudzu lands. In the case on the right, kudzu is going to land right here, and in the case on the left, kudzu is going to land right here. Well, the same thing doesn't happen because most of the energy is available or is being used on the left-hand side in this biodiverse community. Then there is very little risk of invasion by an invasive species like kudzu. I'll show you a picture of what that does here in a second. So maybe it does sprout, maybe it does start to grow, but there's just not enough sunlight, and so eventually that will die. Now, of course, it could become invasive, but it means the chances are less. But over here on the right-hand side, this vine seed sprouts and it grows, and there's energy and sun and water available. And so it can grow and it can cover all of the existing trees right here. We would call the right-hand side, and it's up at the top, it says a monoculture. We have lots of monocultures in kind of modern society because we tend to knock down diverse forests and build things like corn farms where the corn is the only species there. So we would call monoculture, mono meaning one right there. It's one of those recurring root words that we use. So what happens with kudzu specifically is it grows really, really fast. This is a plant from Japan that was imported on purpose, actually, so that people in the American Southeast could plant it in their gardens. But it grew and it spread and it grew and it spread all from about 2009. And now you can find it from South Carolina, maybe North Carolina, all the way over to Louisiana, and it'll grow and cover all the trees. And if you drive to Florida, you can definitely see fields of it just covering trees, really damaging to the trees, really harmful as an invasive species. So in a not diverse community, we would have a high risk of invasion right there. So we're kind of connecting this whole idea of biodiversity, niche invasive species, and organism ecology right here as we finish. But let's try to connect this to the next topic, which is going to be population ecology. So I'm going to erase all that. And what happens with an invasive species, it's pretty easy to tell, but at least it lets us introduce this graph. Let's say that we have an invasive species, right? We can continue with the same exact example of kudzu. We could use zebra mussels, which is a freshwater mussel that has spread from, I believe, Southeast Asia area to the Great Lakes and then down the Mississippi River. And now we can find them in rivers and lakes around Fort Worth. But they can harm native species directly, like the kudzu vines climbing over the top, or they can increase competition because maybe they're taking some of the food sources that the native species would get. Regardless, what you have on a population graph, which is this, we have population on the y-axis, so we're measuring population over time. And so maybe we have some seasonal variation, or year to year, we have a good year and then a drought. Maybe we're measuring the tree population as a botanist in this area. And we get some sort of graph with some seasonal and yearly variation. But then kudzu shows up and starts to spread right there. Well, that's when you see something like this, and that would be the job of some sort of a wildlife ecologist or a wildlife botanist or a botanist in an area where there's a risk of invasion. And so this at least gets us to this whole idea of a population graph, because that's a big part of population ecology, understanding population graphs. So if I move on to the next one, we're going to see population growth curves. Okay, so we're going to draw, this is a bigger one, but it's the same kind of thing, but we're going to start it off from the beginning. We need an example here. And so our example can be as simple as just like a field, a beautiful little field right here. And all of a sudden we get 2 bunnies in the field, right? So we've gone from 0 bunnies over here, and we can put lots up here. I'm not interested in exact numbers. The AP Biology will give you the exact numbers if you want to take that. Time is moving forward. Think generations and not necessarily like days, weeks, months, or years, because that's different for every species. And so we can think generations right here. So if we start off, 2 bunnies will eventually make more bunnies. And so if we did a simple math problem here, we could have these bunnies going from 2, and then they have 2 bunnies. And so now there's 4. And then those 4 bunnies can make 8, and 8 can make 16. And this line is going to look like this right here. So this is a really characteristic shape in certain population growth curves. This is not a straight line. This is an increasing slope in your math classes. And in this class, you're going to call this an exponential curve. At this point, we would say that the births are greater than the deaths right here. Okay, and that's why the population is increasing. Maybe there are some deaths and there's more births and deaths, so the population is going to increase. At a certain point in time, though, because there's not an infinite number of space and not an infinite amount of food, we're going to have a field full of bunnies, and we're going to hit what are called limiting factors. So those limiting factors are going to change one of these things. They're either going to change births or deaths. And so what I want you to think about, okay, do bunnies know that they're approaching the limit of their population, or do they not? And hopefully you realize that bunnies don't have any idea. So when we get up to this point, we're going to have the deaths increase right here. And when the deaths increase and the births stay the same, or we actually say the birth rate stays the same and the death rate increases, then eventually you can get something that looks like this, where at this point, the population is decreasing, so the deaths are greater than the births. And then eventually you can get some sort of a line right here where we could put a dotted line right here. We would represent that as K, and that is the carrying capacity. It is the number of organisms in the species that can be supported by the environment right there. So there's all kinds of different ways you can look at this. As the population is increasing over here in the exponential phase, we would say that it is being regulated by what are called density independent factors. And so that means like things that have nothing to do with the number of bunnies in that space. So the density doesn't matter. What really matters is maybe their gestational period. Is it fast? The number of bunnies that are born at any one time. And when you get up here, we get density dependent factors. And that means now we really care about what the density of the bunnies is. Because if the density of the bunnies gets too big, then you're going to have things like starvation and bunnies dying of thirst. And then you're going to have things like spreading of disease because there's too many bunnies. And so when the population levels out near the carrying capacity, that is being regulated by density independent factors. So imagine we were looking at a different species, right? If we all of a sudden shift over to elephants instead of bunnies, we would get different growth rates. Well, because elephants have a gestational, period, and a female elephant is pregnant for nearly 2 years, I think. Well, and bunnies maybe are pregnant for, I don't know, a month or two. The graph, if you zoom out, would look similar, but it takes the elephants a lot longer to get up there because they're growing a lot slower, they're reproducing a lot slower. Eventually, the graph will have some similar trends, but it's going to also be very different because they have different growth rates, and that has to do with their birth rate and, like I said, gestational time and the number of elephants that are born at one time. So this is a population growth curve right here. Okay, understanding those is a huge part of understanding population ecology, and also understanding what how to like make some predictions, right? What would we predict about certain species? And that's where you get this thing called like KNR species, or KNR types of species. And I just picked two species here. I picked gorillas and I picked roaches, just as two whatever species. So let's use roaches first, right? And so when you think about a roach population, if you imagine like a house, maybe not a very clean house, and a few roaches get inside, and there's lots of food, and we should probably do this in like an outside environment where maybe it's a forest where there's just plenty of extra food, and some roaches show up, and then the population is going to increase really, really quickly. Well, at a certain point, the population is going to get so big with so many roaches, and they're going to eat all the food, and they reproduce really, really fast. And I even looked this up. They can lay, a single female can lay 30 eggs in a week at its like maximum reproductive rate, which is at about 30 months of age. So at 30 months of age, it's reproducing 30 roaches a week, and that's really, really fast. So you're going to get a lot of roaches, and we're going to be well above the carrying capacity for roaches. So let's say that this is the K for roaches. Well, then that means deaths are going to increase and births are going to stay the same. And so we're going to see something that looks like this. The environment will then, so the population crashes, and then it's going to do the exact same thing as the environment produces more of a food source for them, and then it crashes again. So we call these an R species. R selected and R type. There's lots of different ways of saying it, but we call them that because they spend more time in the R region of the graph, that little R actually stands for the birth rate, or the reproductive weight rate, and so it's this population crash and boom. There are certain characteristics of R species that we would expect to see. There is little to no care for the young. There is a large brood size right there. Okay, so you can get rapid population growth in ideal conditions, but then you also get rapid population crashes. Whereas if you were to do the gorilla graph, let's switch colors here so we can do both. It would take gorillas a lot longer to get there. And when they did, they would kind of stay there like this. And they're going to spend a lot more time near the K for gorillas, because they have things like care for young. They have things like small brood sizes. Okay, and so the different species will have very, very, very different graphs. Ooh, let's bring that back. Very, very different graphs when you're looking at kind of what their population growth curve would actually look like, and we call them different things, and so based on that, and so this would be the K species, or K-selected species. Not all mammals are K-selected, and not all non-mammals are R-selected. I always like to give a few examples. A lot of birds, because of the care for their young with bringing food back, a lot of birds are K-selected, and even some reptiles are, like crocodiles, where they make a little nest for their young. And some mammals like mice and rabbits would be over here on the R species because of their rapid gestational time and how many they have in a litter. And so you can't think about it as just mammals and not mammals because it can be either one. All right, and we got two more here. We got a range of tolerance graph, which is another graph that you have to look at when you're thinking about population ecology. And when we think about like why a population is what it is, and so let's put a graph right here. Let's put the population at a specific range, and let's do the range right here. I'm going to use the same exact example that the book does, just because I think it's a really good example. The range is any sort of abiotic condition in the environment that has like that can vary. So we could do like the elevation on a mountain. We could do the distance from the center of a tree, like moving out on branches or something like that. It doesn't matter what we do, but the one that the book uses, because it's a pretty good one, is the temperature of water for steelhead trout. So little fish here. Trout are river fish. They're relatively close relatives of salmon, but they don't spend that time in the ocean that salmon do, and then come back to the rivers. So they're just river fish, right? And their environment. And this is the one that the textbook has done. You would see a graph that looks like this, where the population can exist from 9 to 24. And I might not, and this is, what are we doing here? Degrees Celsius. I might be a little off on the numbers here, but because I think I looked it up online as well, and I'm not sure which one I used. So that right there would be their range of tolerance. So they can exist like that. Anything outside of that, and this would be the zone of intolerance. If the water gets hotter than that, the salmon or the trout are going to die. They're not going to be able to lay eggs. They can't reproduce, and the population will decrease rapidly or slowly, depending on how hot the water actually gets. But we also have this range here, where you can do some math, and it would have to do with standard deviation and things like that. But what you can do is you can find the range where most of them will live, right? Because this is the range. Oh, and I think it gave something like 13 degrees to something like 21 degrees. This is the optimum range right here, where you're going to find the most of these steelhead trout. So the question is, what happens if you have things like global warming? If we're going to give this river 100 years and then maybe expect maybe I don't know, a 2 to 3 degree increase, whatever that might be in the water, then the population is going to decrease as a result, because we're taking their environment out of their range of tolerance or their optimum range. And so we see some effects on their population. All right, next up is population density versus distribution. So this is also explained really well in the book, but it's a good one for me to kind of talk about just to make sure that we're doing good. We have 3 different populations with little dots right here. In each case, let's think about a size of this environment. So let's keep our numbers simple. 10 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 10, 10, 10, and 10. And so in each case, we have 100 kilometers squared, 100 kilometers squared, and 100 kilometers squared. Okay. So then the first question is going to be population density. Density in your chemistry classes, in your whatever classes, physical science classes, math classes, whatever it is. Density is a measure of an amount in a space. And so if we wanted to figure out the density, we could take your amount, which I believe in the left hand is 21, I think. I've done it before. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 21 of these organisms, whatever they are, we'll get to that in a second, per square kilometer. And here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. 25 per 100 kilometers squared. And I believe this one is, again, 21. So if we give these like letters of like A, B, and C, A and C have identical population densities, but they have different population distributions, because on the left-hand side, we would say this is uniform. All of these organisms are spaced out in a way that they have their own space and they're not super clumped up next to the one next to it. Whereas C, these are showing a clumped distribution, meaning they are like all close by one another and hanging out together or growing together if they're plants. Whereas B, which does have a higher density because it is 25 organisms per kilometer squared, which by the way, don't forget, is 0.25 organisms per kilometer squared. And so just do the math right there, and you can divide 25 by 100 and get 0.25 organisms per kilometer squared. Well, this is showing a random distribution, right? And so like there's some are clumped together, some are spaced apart. It seems like it doesn't follow any sort of patterns or things like that. So these you can kind of predict what you would get depending on the type of species that you're talking about. So over here, one good example would be tropical rainforest trees, right? There's plenty of water around, so they're not trying to grow just next to rivers, but they are competing with each other's roots and spots for sunlight, and so they're gonna, if one happens to grow right or sprout right here, it's not gonna grow because all of the sunlight is being used up by this one, and by this one, and by this one, and by this one right here. On the right, C, one of the things you would expect is like herd organisms, right? So think about like bison way back before humans came over and caused a bunch of problems with them. You can think elk and things like that. Well, they kind of clump together because that's how their society, their community works, and so you would expect to see them clumped together like this. Trees in grasslands tend to work in clumped distributions as well because they grow clumped all around the rivers. But there's lots of different examples. Apparently, random is not something that happens very often, and one of the ones that I found is dandelion weeds, because when a dandelion grows and sprouts and turns into the little white puff that you can pick up and blow, all those seeds are blown by wind, and that wind is really random. So you can get a clump of dandelions right here just because the wind dropped some seeds there, but no dandelions right here because the wind wasn't blowing in that direction that day. So we've got uniform, random, and clumped distributions with the densities right here. So that is population and community, no, population, organism and population ecology. And let me stop sharing here real quick so I'm going to try to do this so you guys can take a look and see again if you happen to, miss a little bit in our notes. That way you can take a look at it, and I'll post this on my YouTube channel and show you guys where to find it. And I'll start making these. Hopefully it is helpful for you guys. Bye.